So what's new? Why are supply chains breaking down? What's new about the supply chain that makes it different than any other period in the history of the world? And what's new were two things, and they arose around 1989. The first was you had a combination of increased computing power, algorithms, artificial intelligence, better data collection, so a new model. So you suddenly had the computational telecommunications and data and mathematical tools to be a lot more sophisticated about how you handle the supply chain. But the second thing that happened at the same time was 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. 1991, the collapse, the demise of the former Soviet Union, which gave rise to new trading partners. And at the same time, you had the rise of China. China did have a fairly high growth period in the 1980s, but nothing like we see today. And it all came crashing. That really shut down U.S.-China relations, not fully, but there was no Western investment coming into China. The two countries were distant, and there was just a cold spell between U.S. and China. Well, that ended around 1992. Deng Xiaoping did what he called the Southern Tour, where he reaffirmed China's commitment to capitalist principles. They weren't overthrowing communism, but they were embracing capitalist market ideas. There was a thaw in U.S. relations, and then it was like, no holds barred. Then that's when the U.S. investment really did pour in. So all in a short period between 1989 and 1992, you had the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Soviet Union, new republics. China kind of re-enters the game, and all this was globalization. So now all of a sudden you had the science I described, computing and artificial intelligence and applied math, and a true global market. So now the supply chains could go 9,000 miles from Chongqing to New York, or from Shanghai to Seattle, or London to Hong Kong, of course. So this was true globalization, much larger scale, much longer supply chains, and it worked. And so this was a period I call supply chain 1.0, 30-year period from 1989 to 2019. Now, why did it break down around 2019? I talked to one individual in particular. I was CEO of a Fortune 10 company. He was probably the single individual most responsible for building the modern supply chain. There were a lot of people involved, of course, but this guy was really the leader and is recognized as such. And he told me, because I interviewed him for the book, he said, Jim, you have to understand, it took us 30 years to build this. We blew it up in about 3 years. It's not going to come back overnight. It's going to take 5 or 10 years, or maybe longer, to rebuild in some form. And I think that's exactly right. So what was it, around 2019 that did cause it to break down? Well, really, three things. A lot of people look at the pandemic and they go, oh yeah, COVID, that disrupted everything. That was the problem. And some people look at the war in Ukraine and the Russian sanctions and go, that was the problem. And they both made it worse. They both made it worse, no doubt about it, made the supply chain worse. But it really started in 2018 with Trump's tariffs on China. So Trump put tariffs on appliances and solar panels. Now, technically they were global, but most of that stuff was coming from China. So this was really a shot aimed directly at China. Well, China didn't stand still for that. So China said, well, what can we do to strike back? Well, at the time, China was and is the world's largest importer of soybeans. They need the protein. They don't have enough. The US and Brazil are the two largest exporters of soybeans. Well, China was buying all their soybeans from the United States because they were trying to reduce the trade deficit. We were buying so much stuff from them, and China said, well, what can we buy from the US just to kind of balance the books a little bit? And the answer was soybeans. Well, when Trump put the tariffs on, China redirected all of their soybean orders to Brazil. They stopped buying US soybeans and they bought them all from Brazil. Well, there's a lot more to that than a phone call. I mean, you got vessels and dry bulk carriers and transportation lanes and port facilities. And, if you're Brazil and you get all these orders, you got to get trucks to get the soybeans to the ports. You got to open up port facilities. If you're a cargo vessel operator, you got to redirect all your routes. You got to break long-term contracts, et cetera. The point is, this is a major shift in global logistics just to change the order book from the US to Brazil. Beyond that, people involved in this, they don't want 6-month contracts. They want 5-year contracts, or at least 3-year contracts, and they got them. And so now all of a sudden, China's buying all their soybeans from Brazil, but this scrambled global supply chains. Now, what are the U.S. farmers doing? We're still growing the soybeans. We can't sell them to China. Well, it turns out the Netherlands needed them. So, okay, we'll sell them to the Netherlands and distribute them to Europe, which they did. But once again, instead of Port of Los Angeles, you're using Port of Houston or Port Elizabeth near New York or whatever. And then this went on and on because Trump put more tariffs on to retaliate. China took more actions against the United States, canceled purchase. So, and it escalated from there. Now, again, COVID made it worse. The war in Ukraine made it worse. But it's very clear that that's where it started. So that's why I use 2019 as just, kind of an arbitrary date with a 30-year period of supply chain 1.0. Now we're getting to supply chain 2.0, but we're not there yet. We're in this like messy, in between, inefficient, muddling through period where things are broken, but they'll never be put back together the way they were, but we haven't sort of got the new vase, so to speak. We haven't produced or created the new model supply chain. We're just muddling through, and with a lot of disruption, a lot of empty shelves. The new supply chain, or what I call supply chain 2.0, starting, coming soon, will be what I call a college of nations, meaning there will still be outsourcing, there will still be trading partners, but it'll be like a club. They'll be friends. So they'll be kind of liberal, democratic, advanced economies. So it'll be, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, EU, UK, some other countries. I expect India will be part of it. Brazil will be part of it. And they'll form their own trading blocks. But what that means is China is not going to be in the club. China is, atheistic, communistic, genocidal, abusive of human rights. I could go on, but, you take the point. They're going to have to put their own block together. And so you'll end up with a multi-block world. Maybe some countries like Brazil will trade with China and the U.S. There'll be some some linkages, but really the advanced developed economies, the democratic societies, and even developing economies that happen to be democratic, such as India, will be in this one club, and they'll trust each other, but they won't trust China. There'll be some added costs, but it'll be worth it because we'll avoid the hidden costs. The supply chain revolution has been driven by efficiency, meaning lower costs, which means higher margins for producers and lower costs for consumers. It seems like a win-win. But there were a lot of hidden costs, including fragility, susceptibility to breakdown, toleration of human rights abuses, child labor in the Congo, and on and on and on, that were never taken into account and should have been. And that's the stuff that will start to disappear when you have a club of nations, or what I call a college of nations.